Now, the right to protest peacefully is a basic right in our country. It's been instrumental in shifting the dial in key areas of society. The Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, which is in discussion in the House of Commons today and tomorrow, could change the shape of protests into the indefinite future. It's been met with a lot of criticism. Under the proposed bill, police will be able to impose a start and finish time for protests, set noise limits, stop protests occurring near to Parliament, and more. Are these changes necessary? What are the implications for all of this? I'm going to be talking about this in a moment with a couple of guests from Extinction Rebellion and Sisters Uncut protest groups. First, let's go back to our reporter, Ollie Cole, who's at a protest now on Westminster Bridge. Hello, Ollie.
Hi, John. Well, things have moved a little bit, actually, since we last spoke from Westminster Bridge. We ended up on the south side of the river at Westminster Bridge, where protesters sat for a minute or two and then got back up. We turned around and we're now outside New Scotland Yard, where protesters are staging a bit of a sit-in on the road just opposite New Scotland Yard. They were met by barriers and rows of police protecting the building, of course, but are now chanting kill the bill and other sort of anti-police slogans at the Metropolitan Police headquarters here in central London.
And the police response, Ollie, how is that going?
Well, that at the moment is pretty calm. I mean, officers are just stood outside New Scotland Yard watching proceedings take place. They're behind those metal barriers that I described a moment ago and just sort of watching on. All the protesters, or most of them at least, currently sat down on the floor. So actually no sort of risk of anything kicking off at all at the moment.
All right, Ollie, thank you. That's Ollie Cole, our reporter there at Westminster Bridge. And good evening to Geena, who's from Sisters Uncut, who were behind yesterday's demonstrations at New Scotland Yard and Parliament Square. Hello, Geena.
Hello.
Hi. And Tim Crosland's with us too, from Extinction Rebellion. Hello, Tim.
Hi there, John.
Hi, Tim. Can I just ask you, both of you, first of all, for your thoughts on the proposed changes to the law, which would allow police to do such things as set a start and finish time for protests and take into account noise and nuisance. What are your thoughts on that, Geena, first of all?
I'd really like to talk about this in the frame of what we've seen this weekend. So, we know that thousands of women across the country were moved by the death of Sarah Everard. And every single woman I know feels completely devastated at the moment and just doesn't know what to do with that emotion. So women came to grieve a woman who had been murdered and also to express their anger at so much violence women experience in their lives. A vigil was planned. And at that vigil, those women faced some violence from male police officers. And now I think as the actions of police at vigils this weekend show, police abuse the powers that they already have. And so it feels very alarming that the government plans to give them even more powers through this bill.
OK, so the demo at the vigil at the weekend was in its own context during a pandemic too. Geena, just on that, do you recognise at all that there is something of a dilemma facing officers whose job it is to enforce the restrictions on social distancing and all of the rest of it, and while at the same time respecting people's right to gather, and in this case to show respect for Sarah? Is there a dilemma there that you recognise?
I think what's really interesting here is how we see public safety, because actually 3 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner through domestic abuse. And I would claim that that is a huge public safety issue. Furthermore, I think Chris Whitty did say last week that public gatherings do not cause a spike in COVID cases. So it feels, interesting that that's the line that has been used in this case.
And what about the response you've heard from the Prime Minister? Said he was concerned by what happened at the weekend. The Home Secretary supporting an inquiry into what happened just to find out exactly why the decisions that were taken. Do you take any comfort from that?
In the context of this incredibly concerning bill, no, actually. I think if the government are going to take things seriously, they would halt this bill, which is moving incredibly quickly through Parliament without any adequate time for real understanding of the 300 odd pages of what is in here. So actually, I think there would be much more integrity if they just sat back and said, this seriously warrants consideration. Should we be giving these police more powers? And if we do want to keep communities safe, and if we want to keep women safe, should we actually be going on the evidence and funding domestic abuse services instead?
Tim, on the wider question of protest, does a demonstration need to cause disruption and in that way possibly loss to make its point? Surely that's not necessarily the case at all.
Well, so we wouldn't have the society that we have if protest was about whispering in the corner where nobody was going to hear it. Women wouldn't have the right to vote. We would still have racial discrimination on levels even worse than we have now. We would still have the poll tax, and people will remember the riots against the war in Iraq, if only people had listened to that. This is a cornerstone of our democracy, which is now under assault. And let's make sure we see the wood for the trees on this bill. The most shocking and dramatic part of it is the criminalization of people who are protesting with a 10-year sentence. At the moment, according to the government's own figures, the average sentence for sexual offences is 5 years. The average sentence of violence against a person is 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So now a nurse protesting because her pay is below inflation, while billionaires have been profiting through COVID-19. Now somebody demanding racial justice. Now young people protesting because the government is betraying their future. They face a sentence of 10 years imprisonment. If this was happening in China, if this was happening in Russia, we would be appalled.
I mean, there is an argument, and there will be an argument over the appropriateness or otherwise of the sanctions that are being discussed here. And you mentioned one which has to do with monuments, statues, and so on. And you give a taste of the argument, which is going to take place in the House of Commons and elsewhere. But on the broad principle, Tim, destruction to property, which causes and does cause offence to a great many people. Again, is that an intrinsic part of a protest? Does it have to be so?
This isn't about destruction to property. The 10 years isn't just for graffiti on monuments, whether that's proportionate or not. The 10 years is for anybody causing any disruption, and the Home Secretary may define what that disruption is through secondary legislation without even going through Parliament. So anybody who is part of a protest that meets the Home Secretary's definition of harm stands to face 10 years in prison through this legislation. It is completely extraordinary. The motivation appeared to be a conversation between Rupert Murdoch and Priti Patel. Priti Patel was at Rupert Murdoch's wedding not very long ago. It was after the blockade of Murdoch's press last year that Priti Patel started talking about making conscientious protesters organised criminals.
But if we could just focus on a principle, and there is a principle on the table here, that when it comes to a demonstration, I put it to you because I want to hear your view. When it comes to a demonstration, and it can disrupt the lives of people to the point of people suffering loss, people who want to go to work, need to go to work, maybe will lose income as a result of not going to work. Do you not recognise that those people's rights need to be taken into account, need to be part of the balance of how a demonstration is managed?
Absolutely. We should be talking about disruption and disruption to the public. And we should be listening to what our civil servants are saying, like Sir James Bevan, Chief Executive of the Environment Agency, said last week, on our current trajectory with the climate, the net effects will collapse ecosystems, slash crop yields, take out the infrastructure that our civilization depends on, and destroy the basis of modern economy and modern society. What the Public Accounts Committee said last week is that this government has no plan even to meet its own climate change targets. So when people call that out, when people get onto the streets to demand a future for their children, for our young people, what they're trying to do is avoid disruption from the government's negligence and incompetence.
Yes, I'm simply seeking some acknowledgement from you, Tim, and also from you, Geena, that we're talking about a balance of considerations here. It is not simply an argument with one side to it and one only. Geena, you have your right to protest. Any protester has a right to protest. This is a liberal democracy, is it not? But people also have a right, don't they, to go about their business peacefully.
I do believe strongly that every single person has a right to protest. And I want to speak as a woman. You know, I think it's worth considering that Priti Patel would not even be in the position she is now if it weren't for all of the suffragettes protesting a century ago for the right for women to vote. And those suffragettes were locked up in police cells. They were beaten down by the police as well. And I think, you know, where would we be now if they weren't brave enough to assert their rights that were considered unlawful at the time? And ultimately, every single woman who has voted in an election, every single woman in Parliament who will be voting on this bill, owes a debt to protesters who have come before them, especially in terms of women's rights. And I think it's very important to remember that you never know what you will need to rise up against, and you never know when you may need to do that. Okay. And I don't think it should be, at the discretion of the state as to when you can do that. That sort of defeats the point, really.
Okay, thanks for your perspective. Geena from Sisters Uncut and Tim Crosland from Extinction Rebellion.